October 13, 1942, Duxford Airfield, England, 11:47 a.m. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck pulled back the throttle and felt the P-51 Mustang shudder beneath him like a dog shaking off water. The Allison V1710 engine coughed twice, then settled into an uneven rumble that vibrated through the control stick and into his bones. This was supposed to be the aircraft that changed everything. It wasn't. Tuck taxied past a row of Spitfires, their elliptical wings gleaming in the weak English sunlight. Pilots clustered around them like priests attending sacred objects. Those aircraft worked. Those aircraft won dogfights. Those aircraft kept the Luftwaffe from owning the sky over Britain. The Mustang just looked pretty. He lined up on the grass runway. Duxford still hadn't paved the strips. Kept saying they would. Never didn't advance the throttle to full power. The engine roared. The aircraft surged forward. Tail came up. And within 400 yards the Mustang was airborne, climbing away from the Cambridgeshire countryside with the easy grace of a fighter that had been designed in a wind tunnel instead of a committee room. And for about 30 seconds, Tuck allowed himself to feel optimistic. Then he reached 15,000 feet, and the Allison engine started dying, not catastrophically, not with fire or smoke or any of the dramatic failures that make good stories in the mess hall, just a gradual, insidious loss of power. The engine kept running, the propeller kept turning, but the aircraft stopped climbing, started wallowing, became sluggish and heavy, like a sprinter who'd suddenly remembered he was supposed to be running through mud. Tuck checked his instruments, manifold pressure, dropping RPM, unstable, oil temperature, climbing. Every gauge told the same story. The engine was suffocating. He'd seen it before. Every RAF pilot who'd flown the Mustang had seen it. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison V1710 simply gave up. It wasn't built for high altitude, didn't have a two-stage supercharger, couldn't compress enough air to maintain power in the thin atmosphere where modern air combat happened, which meant the P-51 Mustang's sleek, beautiful, aerodynamically perfect was useless for escort duty, useless for bomber protection, useless for fighting FW-190s and BF-109s that operated routinely at 25,000 feet and above. Useless. Tuck keyed his radio. Duxford Tower, this is Stanford Tuck. Terminating test flight, returning to base. The tower controller's voice crackled back, professional but weary. Roger, Stanford Tuck. Any issues to report? Tuck looked at his altimeter. Still stuck at 15,000 feet. Still unable to climb. Still another magnificent aircraft that couldn't do the one job that mattered. Same as always, he said. Runs like a dream until you actually need it to fight. He pushed the nose down and headed back to Duxford, the Mustang descending eagerly, happily, freed from the burden of trying to be something it wasn't designed to be. 300 miles away, in a cramped office at the Rolls-Royce facility in Hucknall, Ronald Harker stared at a performance chart and tried to solve a problem that was untechnically his responsibility. Harker was a test pilot, not an engineer, not a designer. His job was to fly aircraft, evaluate their characteristics, write reports that other people used to make decisions. He wasn't supposed to redesign anything, but he couldn't stop thinking about the Mustang. He'd flown one himself 3 weeks earlier, demonstration flight arranged by the RAF to show Rolls-Royce what the Americans were building. Harker had climbed into the cockpit skeptical. North American Aviation was a relatively new company. The P-51 had been designed in just 120 days, which seemed insane. Everyone knew aircraft design took years of careful development, wind tunnel testing, prototype refinement. You couldn't just sketch a fighter on a napkin and expect it to work. Except somehow, North American had done exactly that. The Mustang was extraordinary. Harker had felt it immediately, the smooth airflow over the lamellar wing, the responsive controls, the tight turning radius, the visibility from the bubble canopy. At low altitude, the aircraft was phenomenal. Fast, agile, efficient. It could outrun Spitfires below 10,000 feet, could outturn Me-109s, could fly farther on a single tank of fuel than anything else in the Allied inventory. And then he'd tried to climb above 15,000 feet. The performance chart on Harker's desk showed the problem in brutal clarity. Below 12,000 feet, the Mustang's speed curve was nearly horizontal, fast at sea level, still fast at altitude. But above 15,000 feet, the line dropped off a cliff. At 20,000 feet, the P-51 was slower than a hurricane. At 25,000 feet, it was barely faster than a bomber. The airframe was perfect. The engine was wrong. Harker picked up a pencil and did something he'd been thinking about for 3 weeks but hadn't quite had the courage to commit to paper. He drew a second line on the charter theoretical line. A what-if line showing what the Mustang's performance might look like with a different engine, not the Allison V1710, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Merlin was the engine in the Spitfire, in the Hurricane, in the Lancaster bomber, and the Mosquito bomber. It was Britain's most successful engine design, a 27-liter V12 with a two-stage two-speed supercharger that maintained power all the way up to 30,000 feet. It was heavier than the Allison, more complex, more expensive, and it was the answer. Harker stared at his theoretical performance line. If the numbers were even close to accurate, a Merlin-powered Mustang wouldn't just be good at high altitude, it would be dominant, faster than anything Germany had, longer ranged than any escort fighter in existence, capable of accompanying B-17 bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It would change the war. But there was a problem. Several problems, actually. First, Rolls-Royce was already building Merlins as fast as humanly possible, and every single engine was spoken for. Spitfire production, Lancaster production, export orders to the Soviet Union. There were no spare Merlins sitting in warehouses waiting for experimental modifications. Second, the Mustang was an American design. Rolls-Royce was British. Getting permission to modify a foreign aircraft with a proprietary British engine would require approvals from multiple governments, military commands, and corporate bureaucracies, each with their own priorities and timelines. Third, and this was the part that kept Harker awake at night, he was just a test pilot. He had no authority to authorize engine swaps, no budget to build prototypes, no political influence to push the idea through official channels. All he had was a pencil sketch on a performance chart and the absolute certainty that he was right. Harker looked at the chart for a long time. Then he picked up the telephone on his desk and dialed a number he'd been given at a cocktail party 6 months earlier, number he'd been told to call. If you ever have an idea worth stealing. The phone rang 4 times. Then a voice answered, clipped and efficient. Hives, speaking. Ernest Hives, managing director of Rolls-Royce, one of the most powerful men in British aviation. Not someone a test pilot normally called directly. Harker took a breath. Mr. Hives, this is Ronald Harker. We met at the Farnborough demonstration last spring. I'm calling about the North American Mustang. A pause. The American fighter. The one with the power problems. Yes, sir. I think I know how to fix it. Another pause. Longer this time. Harker could hear papers rustling. Could imagine Hives checking his schedule, calculating whether this conversation was worth his time. You have 5 minutes, Hives said finally. Convince me. Harker looked down at his sketch. At the theoretical performance line that promised everything. At the solution that was so obvious he could unbelieve no one else had thought of it. What if, Harker said slowly, we put a Merlin in it? Silence on the other end of the line. Not dismissive silence, thinking silence. When Hives spoke again, his voice had changed. How soon can you get to Huck? Back at Duxford, Robert Stanford Tuck climbed out of the Mustang, and was immediately surrounded by ground crew waiting for his assessment. They already knew what he was going to say. Everyone always said the same thing. Lovely aircraft, Tuck told them, pulling off his leather flying helmet. Absolute joy to fly, can't fight above 15,000 feet. Next. The crew chief nodded wearily and made a note on his clipboard. Another test flight. Another confirmation of what they already knew. The Mustang was a beautiful failure-an aircraft that did everything right except the one thing that mattered. Tuck walked toward the operations building, already thinking about lunch, already forgetting about the Mustang because there was no point dwelling on aircraft that could undo their jobs. He had no idea that 300 miles away, a test pilot was about to change everything. October 15, 1942, Rolls-Royce facility, Hucknall, 9:15 a.m. Ernest Hives stood in the experimental workshop, arms crossed, staring at the Mustang like it was a puzzle missing one critical piece. The aircraft had arrived 2 days earlier on a flatbed truck disassembled, carefully wrapped, accompanied by 2 very nervous American liaison officers who'd been told to observe but not interfere. Getting the aircraft had required 3 phone calls to the Air Ministry, 2 to the American Embassy, and 1 very awkward conversation with North American Aviation's president, who couldn't understand why the British wanted to gut one of his fighters. Hives hadn't told him the truth. Not yet. The truth would sound insane until he could prove it wasn't. Ronald Harker walked across the workshop floor, blueprint rolled under one arm, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. 24 engineers and mechanics watched him. Rolls-Royce men, some of the best aviation minds in Britain, all wondering why their managing director had authorized this experiment. Gentlemen, Hives said, his voice carrying across the hangar, Mr. Harker believes this aircraft can win the war. He's going to explain how. Every eye turned to Harker. He unrolled the blueprint on a workbench, a detailed schematic of the Mustang's engine bay, annotated with measurements, clearances, and mounting points. The Allison V1710 was drawn in precise detail beside it. In red pencil, Harker had sketched the outline of a Rolls-Royce Merlin. The two engines were nearly the same size, nearly the same weight, nearly compatible, nearly the problem. Harker began, pointing to the Allison schematic. Isn't the aircraft? It's brilliant. Best airframe design I've ever flown. Low drag, excellent handling, extraordinary range. The Americans got everything right except the power plant. One of the senior engineers, James Pearson, a man who'd worked on Merlin development since 1935, raised his hand. The Allison is lighter, simpler, cheaper to produce. Why do they use it? Because North American was building for low-altitude reconnaissance, Harker explained. The original British specification called for an aircraft to operate below 10,000 feet tactical reconnaissance, close air support, interdiction missions. For that role, the Allison is perfect. But the war changed, Hives interjected. The war changed, Harker agreed. Now we need high-altitude, escort fighters, aircraft that can protect bomber formations at 25,000 feet. The Allison can't do that, but the Merlin can. He pulled out his performance chart, the one he'd sketched 3 weeks earlier, now rendered in proper engineering detail by the drafting department. 2 curves, one showing the Mustang's actual performance with the Allison, dropping off catastrophically above 15,000 feet, the other showing theoretical performance with a Merlin, maintaining speed and power all the way to 30,000 feet. The difference was staggering. Pearson studied the chart, his skepticism visible. Theoretical, you're basing this on calculations and test data from the Spitfire, Harker said. The Merlin maintains 1,300 horsepower at 20,000 feet. The Allison drops to barely 800. In the Mustang's airframe, which has half the drag of a Spitfire, that power advantage would translate to speeds we've never seen before. Another engineer spoke up, William Shalley, propulsion specialist. The Merlin weighs 300 pounds more than the Allison. That changes the aircraft's center of gravity, could make it unstable. We add ballast to the tail section, Harker countered. Maybe 150 pounds. Still leaves us net positive on weight efficiency. The Merlin's reduction gear housing is different geometry. The propeller mounting won't align. We machine a custom adapter. 3 days in the shop. Cooling requirements are higher. The radiator system isn't designed for Merlin temperatures. The Mustang's belly radiator is already oversized. We increase coolant flow rate and add a second oil cooler. The airframe can handle it. Shalley frowned. You've thought this through. For 3 weeks, Harker admitted. Every night, every problem has a solution. None of them are insurmountable. Hives watched the exchange with the detached interest of a man evaluating a high-stakes bet. He'd built Rolls-Royce into the premier aero engine manufacturer in the world by trusting 2 things: mathematics and instinct. The mathematics said Harker's proposal was sound. The instinct said something bigger was at play. Here's what I don't understand, Hive said quietly. The Americans are brilliant engineers. North American Aviation isn't some backwater company. Why didn't they think of this? Harker had anticipated the question. Because they're not flying combat missions over Germany. They won't feel the pain we feel every time we lose a bomber formation because our escorts coup onto each altitude. They're solving American problems: ground attack, tactical support. We're solving a different war, so we're smarter than the Americans. No sir, we're more desperate. The workshop went quiet. That was the truth no one wanted to say out loud. Britain was hanging on by a thread. The bomber offensive against Germany was bleeding crews faster than training could replace them. Every mission deeper into the Reich meant more losses, more widows, more names carved into memorial stones. The Americans would join the strategic bombing campaign eventually, but eventually might be too late. Hives turned to Pearson. Can we do this? Pearson looked at the blueprint, at the performance chart, at Harker's annotations. He was quiet for a long moment, a kind of silence that means an engineer is running calculations in his head, checking assumptions, looking for fatal flaws. Technically, Pearson said finally, yes, we can physically mount a Merlin in that airframe. Whether it flies afterward is another question. How long to build one prototype? 6 weeks if we prioritize it. 8 if we do it properly. Do it properly in 4 weeks. Pearson's eyebrows shot up. Mr. Hives, that's 4 weeks, Hives repeated. I'll get you authorization, resources, and whatever manpower you need. But I need this aircraft flying before Christmas. Why Christmas? Hives pulled a folded telegram from his jacket pocket and handed it to Pearson. It was from Air Ministry, dated 2 days earlier. Pearson read it, his expression darkening with each line. The telegram detailed the latest bombing raid over Schweinfurter critical ball-bearing factory deep in Germany. The 8th Air Force had sent 228 B-17 flying fortresses, 60 never came back, 600 men dead or captured in a single afternoon. The mission was considered a success because they'd hit the target, but they couldn't sustain those losses, not for long, not without better escorts. The Americans are planning deeper raids, Hives said quietly. Berlin, Munich, Vienna, targets that require 1,500-mile round trips. No existing fighter can make that distance. But the Mustang can if it has the right engine. Pearson handed back the telegram. For weeks, Hives confirmed. Harker felt something shift in the room, the transition from theoretical discussion to committed action. This was happening. They were actually going to do this. Take an American fighter, rip out its American engine, replace it with British technology, and hope the result didn't kill the test pilot. Who would be him, obviously. One more thing, Hives said, addressing the entire workshop. This project is classified. You don't talk about it outside this building. You don't mention it to your wives, your friends, or the press. The Americans don't know we're doing this. The Air Ministry barely knows. If this fails, we need to be able to bury it quietly, and if it succeeds. Someone asked. Hives smiled, a rare expression on a man not given to optimism. If it succeeds, gentlemen, we'll have invented the aircraft that ends the war. The work began immediately. The Mustang was rolled into the center of the workshop and elevated on jacks, its belly exposed like a patient on an operating table. 2 teams formed, one to carefully remove the Allison engine without damaging the airframe, another to prepare a Merlin for installation. The Allison came out first. 16 bolts, 4 fuel lines, 3 electrical harnesses, 2 hours of careful work. When the engine finally lifted free on the overhead crane, the workshop fell silent. They were committed now. There was no Allison to put back if this didn't work. The Mustang's engine bay looked strange without its power plant, a hollow cavity of cables and plumbing, waiting to be filled with something better. Harker stood beneath the aircraft, looking up into that empty space, and felt the weight of what they were attempting. This wasn't just an engine swap, it was a fundamental rethinking of what the Mustang could be, what it should be. One of the junior engineers approached a young man named David Hobbs, fresh from university, assigned to this project because he'd written his thesis on supercharger efficiency. Mr. Harker, Hobbs said nervously, I've been running the numbers. The performance gains you're predicting ... They seem too good to be true. They do, Harker agreed. What if we're wrong? What if the Merlin doesn't integrate properly? What if the aircraft handles differently, or the range decreases? Or then we'll have wasted for weeks and embarrassed ourselves in front of the Air Ministry. That doesn't concern you. Harker looked at the empty engine bay, then at the Merlin waiting on its stand. 1,650 horsepower of precisely machined British engineering, wrapped in magnesium alloy and hope. What concerns me, Harker said quietly, is doing nothing. 600 men died over Schweinfurt, because we didn't have the right aircraft. How many more will die next month, or the month after? If there's even a chance this works, we have to try. Hobbs nodded slowly. When do you test fly it? The moment it's ready. Aren't you afraid? Harker smiled, terrified. But that's not a reason to stop. November 3, 1942, Rolls-Royce facility. Day 19. The Merlin engine hung suspended over the Mustang's empty bay, swaying slightly on the crane's cable like a pendulum counting down to something irreversible. James Pearson stood beneath it, one hand raised, guiding the crane operator with subtle gestures. Left, forward, down, stop. The engine descended slowly, incrementally, while 6 mechanics positioned themselves around the airframe with hands ready to catch, guide, stabilize. This was the moment that would prove whether 3 weeks of work had been brilliant innovation or expensive delusion. The Merlin's mounting lugs aligned with the Mustang's engine frame, almost 3 millimeters off on the port side. Pearson made a circular motion with his finger, rotate slightly clockwise. The crane operator adjusted. The engine turned a fraction of a degree. Perfect alignment. Lower, Pearson said quietly. The Merlin descended the final 6 inches. Metal touched metal. The mounting lugs seated into their brackets with a soft metallic click that echoed through the workshop like a pronouncement. It fit. Harker, watching from 10 feet away, released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 19 days of modified mounts, custom adapters, repositioned plumbing, and re-engineered cooling systems had all come down to this moment. The moment when theory met reality and either validated or destroyed everything they decalculated. The engine fit, now they just had to make it work. The integration problems started immediately. The Merlin's propeller reduction gear was positioned for inches further forward than the Allison's, which meant the propeller didn't align with the spinner. William Shalley solved it by machining a custom extension shaft 36 hours in the machine shop, working around the clock, producing a piece of steel so precisely balanced that it could spin at 3000 RPM without vibration. The coolant system was next. The Merlin ran hotter than the Allison, not dangerously hot, but hot enough that the Mustang's existing radiator couldn't dissipate the heat fast enough. They added a second coolant matrix, rerouted the plumbing through the belly scoop, and increased the coolant flow rate by 40%. Then they tested it by running the engine at full power for 20 minutes while monitoring temperatures with thermocouples taped to every surface. The engine stayed cool. The radiator held. The plumbing didn't leak. One problem solved. 17 more to go. The electrical system was a nightmare. The Allison used a 12-volt system. The Merlin used 24-volt. Every instrument, every relay, every connection had to be rewired or replaced. David Hobbs spent 4 days buried in the Mustang's electrical bay, emerging periodically covered in grease and swearing in ways that surprised the senior engineers. The Americans, Hobbs announced during one particularly frustrating afternoon, designed this aircraft for mechanics who actually want to fix things. Everything is accessible. Everything makes sense. It's infuriating how logical it is. Pearson looked up from the fuel system schematic he was annotating. Is that a compliment? I think so. I'm too tired to tell. The fuel system required its own set of modifications. The Merlin consumed fuel faster than the Allison, not by much, but enough that the Mustang's existing tank capacity would reduce its range by nearly 10%. Unacceptable. The whole point of this exercise was to create a long-range escort fighter. They added to fuselage tanks, one behind the pilot, one in front of the cockpit, increasing total capacity from 180 gallons to 269 gallons. The additional weight changed the aircraft's center of gravity, making it tail-heavy. They compensated by adding lead ballast to the nose, then recalculating the trim settings for every flight regime. By November 10, day 26, the aircraft looked less like a P-51 Mustang and more like a Frankenstein experiment held together with custom parts and engineering audacity. But it was nearly complete. Harker walked around the aircraft slowly, clipboard in hand, checking off items on a pre-flight inspection list that had grown to 3 pages. Propeller, custom-built, perfectly balanced. Engine, Merlin 61, pulled from Spitfire production and modified for Mustang installation. Cooling, upgraded, tested, validated. Fuel system, expanded, plumbed, leak-checked, electrical, rewired, tested, probably working. Probably. He stopped at the cockpit and peered inside. The interior looked mostly familiar. Same stick, same rudder pedals, same instrument panel, but the engine gauges had been replaced with Merlin-specific versions, and there were new indicators for the supercharger staging and intercooler temperature. Ernest Hives appeared beside him, silent as always, hands clasped behind his back. How does it look? Like an aircraft that might fly, Harker said, or might disintegrate at 300 miles per hour. Difficult to say which. When do you test it? Tomorrow morning, weather permitting. Hives was quiet for a moment, studying the Mustang with the analytical gaze of a man who spent his entire career evaluating risk versus reward. You know the Air Ministry is watching this very closely. I assumed. They're skeptical. Most of them think we're re-wasting time and resources on an American design when we should be improving the Spitfire. The Spitfire can't escort bombers to Berlin, they know that. But they also know that if this fails, if you crash, if the integration doesn't work, if the performance gains don't materialize, it will be very difficult to convince them to try anything this radical again. Harker turned to face Hives directly. Are you telling me not to fly it? I'm telling you the stakes. This isn't just about one aircraft. It's about whether we can innovate fast enough to win the war. No pressure then. Hives almost smiled. I have complete confidence in you, Mr. Harker. You're either about to become the man who saved the bomber offensive, or the man who proved that test pilots shouldn't be allowed to make engineering decisions. Those are very different legacies. Yes, Hives agreed. Try for the first one. November 11th, 1942, Hucknall Airfield, 6:47 a.m. The Mustang sat on the flight line, alone, painted in standard RAF camouflage but somehow looking different, foreign, like something that belonged to two worlds simultaneously and neither one completely. Harker walked across the tarmac carrying his flight gear, leather jacket, helmet, gloves, parachute pack. The morning air was cold enough that his breath condensed in small clouds. The sky was overcast but high ceiling at 8,000 feet, visibility unlimited. Perfect test conditions. The ground crew was already assembled. Pearson, Shally Hobbs, and a dozen others who'd worked around the clock for 4 weeks to make this moment possible. They stood in a loose semicircle around the aircraft, trying to look confident and failing completely. Pearson approached as Harker began his pre-flight inspection. "We've done 3 ground runs. Engine performs flawlessly. All systems nominal. Oil pressure, coolant temperature, electrical output, everything within specifications. And the unknowns?" Harker asked, running his hand along the propeller blade, checking for nicks or damage. "The unknowns are ... unknown. We can't predict how the aircraft will handle in flight. The weight distribution is different. The power-to-weight ratio is different. The torque characteristics are different. You'll be flying an aircraft that's never existed before. That's what test pilots do, yes. But usually we build prototypes gradually. Test each modification separately. You're testing everything simultaneously. If something goes wrong, we won't know which system failed." Harker finished his walk around and turned to face the gathered engineers. They looked exhausted, hopeful, terrified. He understood the feeling. "Gentlemen," Harker said, 4 weeks ago, this was a mediocre fighter with an altitude problem. Today, it's either the solution we've been looking for, or an expensive mistake. Either way, we're about to find out." He climbed onto the wing and lowered himself into the cockpit. The seat fit perfectly, adjusted weeks earlier during the ground tests. He strapped in, connected his oxygen mask, plugged in his radio lead. The familiar ritual of preparation, the same sequence he'd performed hundreds of times in dozens of different aircraft. But this felt different. This felt like history pivoting on a single flight. Harker primed the fuel system, set the mixture to rich, throttle to idle. He looked out at Pearson and raised his thumb. Pearson nodded and stepped back, giving the ground crew clearance to move away from the aircraft. Harker pressed the starter button. The Merlin coughed once, that characteristic 4-stroke hesitation, then caught with a roar that was simultaneously familiar and alien. Not the smooth American rumble of the Allison, but the sharper, more aggressive bark of British engineering. The whole airframe vibrated differently, felt different, was different. Harker let the engine warm up for 3 minutes, watching the gauges climb into their operating ranges. Oil pressure, good. Coolant temperature, good. Manifold pressure, good. Every indicator suggested the engine was happy in its new home. He advanced the throttle slightly, testing the response. The engine answered immediately, crisp, powerful, eager. He worked the rudder pedals, checking control surface movement. Everything felt normal, better than normal. It felt right. Harker keyed his radio. "Hucknall Tower, this is Mustang X1, requesting taxi clearance." The tower controller's voice came back immediately, tight with anticipation. "Mustang X1, you're clear to taxi. Runway 27, wind 260 at 8 knots. Good luck, Mr. Harker." Good luck. He was going to need it. November 11th, 1942. Hucknall Airfield, 7:03 a.m. Harker advanced the throttle and felt 1,700 horsepower respond with immediate, almost violent enthusiasm. The Mustang leaped forward. Not smoothly, not gradually. It lunged like a predator that had been caged for weeks and suddenly remembered what freedom felt like. Harker corrected with right rudder, more rudder than the Allison had ever required, compensating for the massive torque of the Merlin-esque propeller trying to yaw the aircraft left. He'd expected that, calculated it, briefed himself on it during 3 sleepless nights. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it through your hands and feet are different things entirely. The tail came up at 40 knots. The aircraft accelerated harder, the runway blurring beneath him. 60 knots, 70, 80. He pulled back gently on the stick and the Mustang rotated, nose rising, main gear lifting off the grass runway with barely 500 yards consumed. They were airborne. For 3 seconds, Harker allowed himself to simply fly, gear coming up, flaps retracting, the aircraft cleaning up and accelerating into the climb. The engine note was different than anything he'd heard before. Higher pitched, more aggressive. The Merlin sang where the Allison had hummed, but the aircraft felt stable, controllable, alive. "Hucknall Tower, Mustang X1 is airborne and climbing. Roger, X1. All systems appear normal from here. You're cleared to test altitude." Test altitude, the moment of truth, the whole point of this exercise. Harker leveled off at 5,000 feet and performed the first series of checks, gentle turns left and right, testing control response. The Mustang answered perfectly, crisp and immediate. Maybe even sharper than with the Allison, because the additional nose weight improved the mass distribution. He advanced the throttle to climb power and pointed the nose at the sky. The Mustang accelerated upward like it had been launched from a catapult. The altimeter unwound backwards 6,000 feet, 7,000, 8,000, climbing at nearly 4,000 feet per minute. Twice the rate of the Allison-powered version. The airspeed indicator held steady at 180 knots, the aircraft maintaining speed even in a steep climb. 10,000 feet. The altitude where the Allison version started feeling tired, the Merlin didn't even notice. 12,000 feet. Harker watched the manifold pressure gauge, waiting for the inevitable drop-off as the air thinned and the engine struggled to breathe. It didn't drop. The two-stage supercharger kicked in automatically, compressing the thin air, feeding the engine exactly what it needed. The power stayed constant. 15,000 feet. This was where the Allison-powered Mustang gave up, where every RAF pilot had watched their aircraft turn from thoroughbred to cart horse. Harker was still climbing at 3,500 feet per minute. He keyed his radio, trying to keep his voice professional despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Tower, X1 passing through, 15,000 feet. No power loss. Repeat, no power loss. Continuing climb, there was a pause longer than necessary for radio transmission. Harker could imagine the scene in the tower, Pearson and Hives standing by the radio operator, watching through binoculars, holding their breath. Roger, X1. The tower controller finally responded, and Harker could hear the excitement bleeding through the professional tone. The Merlin roared like it was angry at the altitude for existing. The supercharger whined in perfect harmony. The aircraft climbed with an eagerness that felt almost aggressive, as if it resented ever being held below 15,000 feet. 22,000 feet. Harker glanced at his airspeed indicator. 175 knots. Still fast. Still powerful. He tried a gentle turn. The controls felt precise, responsive, exactly as they should. 25,000 feet. At this altitude, the Allison-powered Mustang would have been wallowing, barely controllable, slower than a training aircraft. Harker rolled into a steep bank and pulled 4 Gs through a tight turn. The aircraft responded instantly. No mush. No buffet, no hint of weakness. He leveled out and checked his gauges. Every single one read normal. Oil pressure, perfect. Coolant, temperature well within limits. Engine running as smoothly at 25,000 feet as it had at sea level. The modification worked. Not theoretically, not on paper. Not in calculations or wind tunnel models or hopeful projections. It actually worked.